Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 25th episode of the Soccer Scene with myself, Adrian, and joined once again, of course, by Noel O'Connor. Noel, we've a lot to get through this evening. Obviously, the FAI Cup win was very positive for Treaty last week. Treaty were heavy favourites going into the game. Noel, they did defeat Usher Celtic 5-0. As Mark Ludden actually alluded to after the game, he said Treaty certainly didn't have it all their own way in the first half. It was a tight game, a 1-0 deficit. Second half, obviously, as you'd expect, really, I suppose, fitness levels with the fact that the junior team haven't started their full season, or in their case, Leinster Senior League team. But, the fitness levels of Treaty you'd expect it to come good. Two positives to take, obviously, Treaty getting another clean sheet, Noel, and Success Udigan scoring a great goal with basically the last kick of the game as well to get off the mark for Treaty. So, overall, a good evening.
Yeah, look, it was a comfortable win. They're right to be a bit disappointed with the first half. We just remarked in the setup, for the Treaty first goal that Usher didn't look organised from the corner at all. It was a nice cushion to get a fine header by Gearns. But other than that, they didn't do a whole lot in the first half. In fairness to Usher, they got it down and played. They dominated the middle of the park, and they had a couple of players that, looked a bit of a handful, but in fairness to Treaty, they were doing all this good stuff, if you like, away from the Treaty goal. Now, they did get a couple of chances. We actually marked ourselves. There was a couple of guys, there was one offside call where it seemed that the linesman actually flagged the wrong player offside. The guy who got the goal for Usher was actually onside, but once they come out in the second half, and I actually said that they seemed to have more possession for the first 2 minutes of the second half than they had in the whole of the first half, and once they got that second goal, the tie was effectively over.
Yeah, certainly, and obviously then today, Noel, the second round draw made last 16. To be fair, Treaty couldn't have asked for much better, with all due respect to the team they did draw, which is Maynooth University Town. It's away from home, obviously, which we did remark can be tricky against the lower league teams who do want to take a scalp and obviously get to the last 8 in this case, which is a huge carrot. But you would be expecting, considering some of the draws we saw where Cork City, a fellow first division team, have to go to Derry, and Wexford have to face Dundalk, and Galway have to face UCD. It's definitely a great draw and a great opportunity for Treaty to reach the last 8.
Look, it's a fantastic draw for Treaty. There's no doubt about it. We spoke last week about trying to negotiate a few rounds, and at that stage, you never know what might happen. And look, it is a great draw. I think, in fairness, Maynooth University Town will pose a little bit more of a problem than Usher ultimately did on Friday night. I'd be familiar enough with the university scene. The football in Maynooth is quite strong. The likes of Sean Horner, who's now playing with Dundalk, would have come through that system. And at the higher end of it, the standard is pretty good. They have an RDO up there in Barry Prendeville. He's been there now for well over 10 years. Has great experience in the league. He played with Pats. He won a league with Pats, actually, and he's put a massive amount of work in there. And I remember talking to him a few years ago, and they were talking about getting the team up and running, if you like, for the summer. And this is his brainchild. They'll certainly look forward to this game. And, in fairness, we spoke last week about the lack of preparation that Usher would have had. The fact that this game, it probably won't be on for another 2 or 3 weeks, so they'll have 2 or 3 weeks more training done. They'll probably have a couple more matches played. They'll be buoyed up by their win over the weekend. And while you would expect Treaty to get through, it certainly will be a lot more difficult, I think, than the game against Usher on last Friday night.
Absolutely, and complacency will certainly be the main enemy for Treaty, and hopefully they'll be going into that game in decent form. We'll obviously get on to know the fact that Treaty returned after 3 weeks break, actually, to league action against Waterford FC. Themselves had a brilliant win, actually, against the cup holders, St. Patrick's Athletic, at the weekend. So, full credit to Waterford on that. But before we go on to that, I suppose a couple of things from the other night, maybe in the team. What did you make, Noel, of the performances of the new players, we'll say, on the block for Treaty? You had Ben O'Riordan, who played most of the game at right back, moved into centre for the last 10 minutes, centre back for the last 10 minutes. You had Darren Collins made his first appearance, I believe, at right back. I know he can play as a striker, I think, as well. And then obviously Success Udigan, as we said, scored a very good goal, got about a half an hour of action as well. What did you make of the performance of the 3 newbies?
I suppose it was difficult to really make any big evaluation. I put more store into Ben's performance for the last 20 minutes against Longford a few weeks ago home. I thought he acquitted himself quite well. Daniel Collins came on, the game was effectively over. There was no threat coming down his side. If he is going to play at right back, we need to see, can he defend? He passed the ball well, he looks quite comfortable on the ball. And I think success, as I said before, is a good signing for Treaty. Give him something different, particularly against the stronger sides in the league, where Treaty are inclined to sit back, if you like, and play in their own half. I think a guy like him who can run in behind and who's a strong, powerful guy would certainly be a help, particularly maybe if they nick a goal away from home and they want to sit in that, if you like, which is fine, and they sit back and the ball is played into the space behind the opposition back four. So look, as I said, I think it's a very important move for him. There's been a lot of talk about him the last 3 or 4 years, and he's coming to the stage now where he certainly needs to deliver on a consistent basis, and that goal should give him a massive boost at the start of his Treaty career.
Yeah, definitely. So we did mention, Noel, that obviously because of maybe departures and players shifting from one position to the other and a couple of injuries, obviously, maybe particularly in the first half when Ulster Celtic did have a lot of possession, they were playing some nice triangles, good technical players, to be fair. But we did mention how, you feel maybe that the dynamic isn't right in the midfield for Treaty with Lee Devitt and Joe Collins in there together. And I suppose, going to your point last week, maybe the signing of the likes of Collins at right back and O'Riordan being able to play right back when Jack Lynch does return, which we believe will be after Waterford game in the week after, So would you say that maybe because the dynamic, isn't exactly right, but by the seams of it, but those two, that maybe Jack Lynch could come back into midfield rather than right back?
I'd like to think so now, and you're right. I think it's a I thought against Longford as well, I think it's a kind of a cause for concern for Treaty, the performance of the middle of the park. They're certainly not dominating possession. They're second best in terms of that, and most of the play or the restarts are getting the ball up to the likes of Enda Curran and Dean George is coming from the likes of Mark Ludden in particular, and either Jack Lynch or whoever who's playing right back, and there's very little flow of the ball through the middle, and I thought they were outplayed because I didn't see them. Look, if they're not great on the ball, that's fine, but they certainly didn't put a lot of pressure on the Ulster midfield either in terms of stopping them doing from they wanted to do, and they certainly had a free run in that first half. While it was far away from the Treaty goal, as we said, but teams with better front twos and front threes, if their midfield gets that kind of dominance against Treaty, it certainly is a worry going forward. So the fact that Tommy brought in 2 right backs, if you like, he must be thinking in his head, I think Treaty certainly function a lot better with Jack in the middle of the park or Callum McNamara. Both of them were needed for the back four, and I'm sure their fingers are crossed now that one of those guys will actually cement their position as right back and would free up Jack to play in the middle of the park between now and the end of the season.
Yeah, it's either, as you said, it's either that or maybe Ben O'Riordan will play next to Sean Gear and Jack will play right back and Callum McNamara might move into that spot. I suppose another player we have omitted because we haven't seen maybe that much of him recently is Mark Walsh, who could be another player. I know he set out the game last week. I'm not actually sure what his status is going into the Waterford game this week, but obviously he's a player who, considering last year he made such an impact and really well for Treaty, that you'd say would make a difference in the midfield, or could play obviously at centre back for them as well.
Yeah, he'd make a massive, like as you say, he's been out for so long, we've kind of forgotten about him, and as we don't get kind of injury updates from Treaty, he can go a bit under the radar, but certainly a really, really good player, and I would be in favour of him going back centre back. I think he's done very well with Sean Gearns as well in the past, and the form that Callum McNamara is in, if you could put him back into the middle of the park, I think it would be a massive boost for the team overall.
Definitely. We did allude to it earlier on, but obviously a big game this weekend. Noel, both teams are actually in very good form, Treaty and Waterford. I know that Waterford did lose that game against Longford. They turned on a sending off for their new signing, Outria, who has actually made quite an impact since he came in, obviously, as you could see with the game against St. Patrick's Athletic. I mentioned that to you. St. Patrick's Athletic, they went to overturn Pats. I know St. Pat's had that European exertion, so Waterford probably took full advantage of that as well, playing them 3 days after that, to be fair. But a great win for them. And had the previous meetings with them, Noel. Really have got the better of them in Limerick twice. Obviously, the Munster Senior Cup being one of them at the very start of the season, so it's hard to judge on that. Then they had a good win to Marksfield. The most recent meeting, Treaty will obviously want to have revenge for that, because you're 0-0 at half time and you go out and you can see 4 goals and lose 4-0 in the second half. So, as Mark Ludden actually said as well on the night, they were taught a lesson in the 10-minute period by Waterford. So certainly going to be, as we know, a very tough test for Treaty, and definitely their toughest in a few weeks.
Yeah, it's a real difficult one to call. As you say, the topsy-turvy form as well with Waterford, allied to the fact that since they played last Leon Britton is it, and Keane Kavanagh here is gone as well now to Derry on a contract, although Phoenix Patterson looked in really good form against Pats with a real smashing winning goal. And something you mentioned as well about the sending off, I think that was key to the game here in the Markets Field as well. Waterford had a man sent off fairly early in the game, and even at that, they played some really good football, and they were probably a bit unlucky not to nick a point towards the end of the game with a set play. But Treaty are in fantastic form now with the wins, and I'm more focused on the league. They had a comprehensive win over Longford, and it's a really big game between the two of them, because, as we said a while back, it looks like that there's kind of 3 teams going for 2 places now in the playoffs, with the likes of Longford and Treaty and Wexford, and Waterford aren't a million miles ahead as they were maybe a while back, and it could be a game if Treaty could win it that to really put a cat amongst the pigeons. And I'm sure in the back of Treaty's minds, the highs of the European game for Pats 3 days later, see what happens. I know there's probably a week between it, but I'm sure Waterford are very, very high after their cup win, and their managers and coaches will have a real job on their hands now to bring them back down to earth, if you think, and get them ready for what will be a difficult trip to the Markets Field for them.
Yeah, definitely. And I know, judging by social media, actually, Noel, which is obviously not the best place to start when you're looking at a reference point for anything, but just looking at maybe there was a bit of Twitter outrage over the Keane Kavanagh move to Derry, because obviously they had already lost Britain, as you mentioned, Cork, which was a stinger for Waterford, that's for sure. But there's a lot of unrest about, are we going to sign players? But I suppose if you look at the danger men for Waterford, as I said, Austria came in. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm not going to lie. And then you have, Junior Quaterna in the danger areas. You've got Phoenix Patterson. So they're still very lively in terms of that area of the field, to be fair. So even though it seems to be a bit of unrest from Waterford, probably more so to do with the fact that they're so far behind Galway and Cork anyway. But, in terms for Treaty, it doesn't really change that much with those players. Well, particularly Kavanagh has only recently gone.
No, it doesn't. And they are going to be a handful, and they're certainly a side that can play good football as well, and they're dangerous to set plays. They scored a couple as well against Treaty in the last game. But I suppose they started the season so poorly, and then Ian Morris was sacked, and they got the local duo in, and they went in a kind of an 8-match winning run. And I was really surprised at that stage that they did bring in a new manager. I thought they would have waited until the end of the season, and they've had a couple of blips since, including the defeat to Longford. So as I say, it's the form is so unpredictable in the last few weeks. I think you'll see a really kind of a game of chess. I think Treaty will do their usual. They'll sit nice and tight and let Waterford come at them, and Waterford want to play. They kind of play the perfect game at times, and it could be a very, very tight game.
Certainly, and to come on to the Treaty team, Noel, obviously we've mentioned about a couple of players being injured, Jack Lynch, Mark Walsh, who we don't expect to see on the evening. I suppose most of the positions, Noel, in the team are fairly set in stone. You'd expect Jack Brady to come back in. You'd have Mark Ludden, and so on and so forth. And the Curran, you'd imagine, will be part of Dean George. Really, I suppose it's maybe the midfield and the wingers that you're looking at, because it could look a straight shootout maybe on either side between Melody and Armshaw for the left-hand side, and then Matt Keane and Joel Costrain for the right-hand side, you'd imagine, because those positions certainly aren't set in stone.
No, there's a good bit of competition there, and I suppose we have to throw in the Dean George and the Curran one as well. Obviously, both of them were fit on Friday night. I know Enda Curran came on and scored, but Dean George scored as well. We've brought this up a few times in terms of the wide areas, and Willie Armshaw, he kind of burst onto the scene as such with his starts, did really well against Longford. It didn't do a whole lot now against Usher the weekend, and it was probably a game that you probably expected a bit more out of him. I expected a bit more out of both wide players because, you know, from the standard that Joel Costrain has played in terms of playing in the Premier League and Europe, I certainly expected a bit more out of him there as well. And I would have said before that you're probably better off, particularly against the stronger teams, to be solid on one side. And there's a guy that's been kind of out of favour the last 5 or 6 weeks, who's Matt Keane. I've never really seen him play a poor game. And the fact that you're up against probably one of the better teams in the league, I'd be inclined to go with Matt Keane, certainly on the right, and probably Willie Armstrong on the left with his Longford form. But it'll be interesting to see what Tommy wants to do.
Certainly. And I know the August Bank Holiday weekend was a big factor last week, Noel, and due to the fact that Treaty were heavy favourites as well. You'll be hoping as well to see a better crowd at the Markets Field for a bigger game Friday night. Yeah,
I think so. It's a Munster derby, and in fairness to Waterford, they always bring a few as well. In general, it does. It's a bit like Cork, maybe not as big, but certainly you do get a bigger crowd for a game against Waterford, and I'm looking forward to a really good game.